The mistress thought she was replacing the wife until the Mafia summit turned into a locked war zone. Celeste arrived in diamonds, certain Damien was publicly choosing her over Serafina. Then every criminal boss refused to sign. Armed guards sealed the exits, and Serafina entered with her own tactical team. Celeste watched the room physically shift toward the woman Damien had discarded. Within minutes, forged contracts, hidden shooters and explosives were exposed. Celeste finally understood. She had not entered a romantic victory. Damien had brought her into a massacre, and only his wife knew how to get them out alive. He strolled into the banquet hall with his new prize on his arm, and the entire American underworld froze. Nobody sat down, nobody signed a single contract, nobody dared to take a breath. Damien Varela, the heir to the most ruthless syndicate on the East Coast, had just done the absolute unthinkable. He brought his mistress to the table, and he left his wife at home. But tonight he was about to learn a brutal lesson that blood money could never buy, because the woman he left behind was the actual glue holding this entire empire together. Drop your city as in the comments to let me know where you are watching from. Stick around, it is an incredibly long night, and the ugly truth will keep you locked right in. A bootlegger named Caruso built the Blackstone Grand Hall back in 1927. He just wanted a private sanctuary where heavy hitters could handle mob business, far from government eyes. Almost a century later, nothing had really changed. They refinished the marble floors 4 times, swapped out the massive chandeliers twice, and the blood had been scrubbed away more times than anyone cared to admit. The dark soul of the building remained exactly the same. Power came here to make deals, and weakness came here to die. Damien Varela stood at the top of the grand staircase at 8:47 p.m., one hand resting casually on the railing. He felt pretty damn good, honestly, untouchable. He finally felt like a guy completely done pretending. Celeste Moretti clung tightly to his arm. She was striking, the kind of uncomfortable beauty that never asks permission and absolutely never apologizes for the stares. Her dress was a deep, rich burgundy. The diamonds were completely real. The way she glided across the floor proved she spent her whole life mastering how to be watched. Reaching the landing, she leaned softly into Damien and whispered a joke that made him smirk. He just covered her hand with his own. Down below, the massive floor held 43 men and maybe a dozen women. Every single one of them represented the most dangerous organized crime syndicates running across the eastern seaboard and deep into the Midwest. Italians and Russians stood shoulder to shoulder with the Irish and Albanians. There were 2 rising Caribbean crews, plus one highly secretive Chicago outfit that nobody dared to discuss. All of them showed up tonight. For one reason, the Varela family called the meeting. That name still carried so much weight that when they summoned you, you walked right through the door. Damien inherited that brutal weight from his father, who got it from his father before him. The crown came with some incredibly heavy expectations, and one of those expectations was the wife supposed to be standing exactly where Celeste Moretti stood right now. He made his choice 3 weeks ago, sent the memo through all the proper underworld channels. He convinced himself it was strictly business, a clean break that serious bosses handle without any pointless drama. But he never saw this dead silence coming. This was not the quiet before a grand speech, not the soft hum of private whispers, either. This was the crushing, suffocating silence of 43 dangerous people spotting the exact same problem at the exact same time, and, rapidly calculating, the bloody fallout. Carmine Russo ran the northeastern shipping lanes. His face looked like it had caught a few too many beatings, and just decided to live with the damage. Right now, he stood by the bar, gripping a glass of water he absolutely refused to drink. He watched Damien glide down those stairs with a blank stare. A rookie might think Russo looked neutral, but the boss was actually running some very dark, precise math. Damien caught the quiet, but his ego simply spun it into a compliment. Arrogant men always think silence means awe. He paraded Celeste down the final steps like absolute royalty. Hitting the floor, he threw a slick nod to the nearest group of made men. The easy, relaxed gesture of a king who demanded total respect and always got it. All they gave him was a cold, polite distance. The chatter never started back up. Nobody rushed over to shake his hand. Not the younger soldiers. Not the guys drowning in Varela family debt. Not even the desperate climbers starving for FaceTime. They all just froze right in place. Celeste felt the icy drop in the room way before Damien even caught on. Her grip tightened around his arm, though her face remained perfectly carved stone. Varela, Russo had already crossed the floor, stopping just a few feet short. He flicked a quick glance at Celeste, then locked dead onto Damien. He asked where Serafina was. Damien brushed it off. saying Serafina would not be attending tonight. Russo barely blinked, and that frozen stare was an answer all by itself. I see, Russo muttered. Damien pushed right back, asking if there was a problem here. Russo just shook his head, no problem at all, and walked straight back to the bar. Damien watched him retreat. That invincible high was slowly fading away, his supreme confidence slipping, just a bit. He brushed it off as stubborn old men, clinging to completely pointless traditions. The deals would get signed. His empire would keep right on spinning. He found the main Varela table and pulled out a chair for Celeste. A waiter rushed over with expensive wine, keeping the basic illusion of the party alive. But the entire room was humming, on a totally different frequency right now. Damien felt it deep in his chest, just like the heavy, thick air right before a thunderstorm violently breaks. A crushing pressure without a face. 40 grueling minutes dragged by. The summit should have officially kicked off by now, but absolutely nothing was happening. The men just stood in tight little circles, whispering. The massive head table remained completely empty. That was the absolute seat of power, meant for the bosses of the 7 major crime families to anchor the entire night. Every single chair sat perfectly angled, the crystal water glasses fully poured, but not a single person sat down. Damien cornered the event coordinator, a twitchy guy named Petrov, who managed underworld logistics for 15 solid years. Damien snapped at him, demanding to know what the holdup was. Petrov just stared back, looking like a man praying for the floor to swallow him completely whole. The bosses are waiting, Petrov stammered. Waiting for what? Petrov clamped his mouth shut tight. Damien leaned in. Petrov, I said waiting for what? The coordinator swallowed hard, suggesting he really should speak with Don Aguilar. Don Esteban Aguilar was 71 years old. He ruthlessly ran the Mid-Atlantic territory, since before Damien was even born. A compact guy with silver hair, moving with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator who knew stillness held absolute power. He stood by the massive windows at the far end of the room, staring out at the city lights. He never even turned when Damien walked up. Esteban. Damien kept his tone completely flat. We really need to start, yes. Aguilar murmured. We do, then why the hell aren't we starting? Aguilar finally turned around. His eyes were pitch black, that terrifying, focused stare of a man who survived decades in a game where looking away meant taking a bullet. Aguilar studied Damien like an odd stain on the carpet. Where is Serafina? Damien sighed, saying he already cleared this with Carmine. Aguilar did not even blink. This is not Carmine asking. His voice stayed low and incredibly smooth. It never broke once. I am asking you right now, and I am asking on behalf of every single boss in this room. Damien felt a sharp twist deep in his chest. Not fear, he lied to himself, swearing it was not fear, just the sudden, sickening realization that the floor beneath him was completely rotting away. Serafina is home, he stated. She is off the guest list, and he officially restructured how the Varela family is represented going forward. That is your absolute right. Aguilar softly interrupted. What happens inside your own house is your business. Aguilar paused. But this banquet hall is definitely not your house. Damien flared up, reminding him he was the head of the Varela family. They called this summit, so he runs it. Aguilar stayed perfectly calm, almost gentle. That means a great deal. Yes, but this summit will not begin until Serafina Varela is present. Damien glared at the old man, calling it completely insane. Perhaps. Aguilar turned his back and watched the glass again. But those are the rules. It took Damien another 20 grueling minutes of talking to the others. Every single conversation was more enraging than the last, each one dripping with that exact same untouchable, polite poison before the brutal reality finally clicked. This was no hidden conspiracy, not some sudden chaotic mutiny. It was something way harder to crush an absolute consensus. He cornered Fedorov, the boss of the northeastern Russian mob. Fedorov gave a hollow apology, absolutely refusing to budge. He grilled the 2 Caribbean leaders he barely even knew. Both men stayed terrifyingly polite and entirely unmoving. In a desperate move, he even hit the Chicago table. A frail, nerdy-looking guy named Ware sat totally alone. Ware did not even look up. He just muttered that the lady needs to be here, Mr. Varela, and went right back to reading his newspaper. Across the floor, Celeste had quietly slipped into a dark, empty corner. She looked perfectly calm, but her glass sat completely untouched. She was studying every single shadow in the room. Damien marched over. She leaned in close, asking what was going on. Just a little inconvenience, Damien hissed. Old men clinging to their dead traditions. She shook her head. They are not signing a single thing. Not yet. Celeste scanned the predators. She finally understood exactly how the underworld talked. Damien, they will not sign a single paper tonight without her. A sharp, ugly burn flared in his chest. I run the Varela family. He shot back. I know that, Celeste replied. But whatever she actually does behind the scenes, it is pretty obvious it is not the same thing. He turned away. The truth finally hit him in jagged little pieces. Ignored whispers, guarded looks, and that brutal, relentless breakdown from Carmine Russo. Russo clearly decided Damien needed to seize the exact empire he had completely burned down. It all started years ago, way before Damien took full control of the syndicate. A vicious turf war was boiling over between two rival crews. Their borders overlapped, bleeding both sides almost completely dry. The street tension was incredibly thick. This feud was hurtling straight toward an absolute bloodbath. Soldiers were quietly taking their marks. Supply lines were taking incredibly heavy hits. The kind of loud, sloppy violence that pulls federal heat was right on the verge of exploding. And then Serafina made one single phone call. Russo could not say exactly what she told them. He was never inside the room. But the result? Both mob families actually agreed to sit down. Terms were struck. The impending massacre simply vanished. That was 8 years ago. She made other calls too, Russo admitted, staring hard into his glass. More quiet sit-downs over the years. She became something incredibly rare, perfectly neutral party. You get it, a woman with zero territory. No muscle, no real personal stake in the game. She could walk right between rival bosses, and both sides just knew she played it straight. In this life that is rarer than gold. She never told me about it. Damien snapped back. Russo looked right at him. Did you ever actually ask? Damien felt that massive, crushing failure right now. Standing under the harsh hall lights, heavy under 100 watching eyes. He never asked. Because he never once imagined she was doing anything that really mattered. She basically ran the estate, showed up to charity galas. Always so quiet, totally undemanding. He mistook her silence for weakness. 11 years of marriage, and not once did he wonder what she actually did when his back was turned. The shame burning his throat felt physical and entirely real. He forcefully shoved the feeling away. There has to be some other way to handle this, Damien snapped. I am not calling her down here, right after he caught himself. Russo just waited. When it became painfully obvious, Damien would not finish the sentence. Russo did it for him. Right after you paraded your mistress into this hall and expected the entire underworld to play along, Damien stayed dead silent. There is absolutely no backup plan for this, Russo warned. No clever little workaround. The treaties meant to be signed tonight, the port routes, turf boundaries, loan structures, all of it leans on a pretty delicate piece that Serafina built. She maintains it alone. Try forcing those deals through without her, and you are basically pushing useless paper. No boss here respects. You honestly thought they trusted the Varela name? No, they trusted her judgment of the Varela name. Russo pushed back his chair and stood up. Those are two very different things. Damien, always have been. You were just way too incredibly blind to see it. He left Damien standing there completely alone. The summit had completely dissolved into a tense holding pattern. The bar kept pouring drinks. Platters of expensive food sat untouched. Low murmurs echoed, just mob bosses killing time, making no real moves every couple of minutes. A capo checked the main doors, shot Damien a freezing look, and turned away. Celeste finally tracked him down. She looked entirely different than she did an hour ago. That glossy social grace was almost totally gone, replaced by a cold, practical edge. You need to call her, she pushed. No, Damien, she pleaded. I said no. Celeste went quiet for a long beat. What you pulled tonight, parading me in here. I had absolutely no idea what that actually signaled to these people. I really thought it was a statement about us, about claiming what you actually wanted. I had no idea it was. She caught her breath. I did not know what your wife was to them. Neither did I, Damien admitted. The raw truth of that genuinely stung. Celeste held his stare. Call her. He just turned his back. The night outside the tall glass was freezing. The city kept grinding along, completely blind to them. Headlights cutting through intersections. Office buildings quietly going dark. The massive machinery of the real world just kept spinning, totally uncaring about the crisis locked inside this grand hall. Damien had made his choice right in front of everyone, begging Serafa to return right now. Crawling back, his ego violently refused. He simply could not do it. That brutal math of his own pride made it pretty much impossible, so he stood there, completely paralyzed. Meanwhile, the most dangerous criminal syndicate on the eastern seaboard sat doing absolutely nothing, waiting for the very woman he had just banished. He was desperately calculating his next play when the atmosphere suddenly shifted. It happened the way catastrophic things usually do. Absolutely zero warning. Just a sudden, sharp drop in the room's temperature. A heavy door opened somewhere in the back. a muffled voice called out, and then the entire hall, which had been putting up a pretty decent front for 2 hours, went totally, terrifyingly silent. Damien snapped his attention straight toward the main entrance. No one had even announced the incoming motorcade. No one called ahead, or if they did, absolutely nobody bothered to warn the boss. 4 heavy armored SUVs pulled up outside the Blackstone Grand. His door guards just stepped aside, no permission asked. By the time Damien turned around, those heavy mahogany doors were thrown wide open. Serafina Vale stood right there. She skipped the gala gown entirely. Instead, she was dressed for a war room. A tailored dark suit, almost zero jewelry. Her dark hair pulled back with the sharp efficiency of a woman, completely running out of time. She looked exactly as she always did, somehow entirely unremarkable. A woman who easily slipped into a room without ever demanding the spotlight. That was her usual disguise. He had always mistaken it for being plain. The brutal, unforgiving clarity finally hit him right now. He had misread his own wife completely. Serafina scanned the hall. A cold, surgical sweep. The exact gaze of a survivor who spent years dissecting rooms for hidden threats, shifting alliances, and the tiny, incredibly dangerous tells that expose what is really happening beneath the surface. Her eyes tracked right across the divided crime families. Lingering on the empty head table, she noticed Celeste, standing frozen, fully aware she was being measured. Then Serafina looked at Damien. She held his stare for a beat, untethered from time itself. Just a flat, unnerving look. Absolutely zero anger, no betrayal he could easily manage. She gave him absolutely nothing to fight against. And then she just looked away. Carmine Russo was the first to break the tension. Crossing the floor with shocking speed for a heavy, aging man, he reached her near the foyer, urgently, whispering something into her ear. Serafina listened closely, giving a single nod. Then Aguilar pushed off the window glass. Other capos quickly followed his lead. No sudden rush, just a powerful, steady gravity pulling them right in. Lethal men who had spent 2 hours nervously pacing the floors had finally found their true north. Damien watched his wife step into the empire he supposedly ruled. Embraced by the syndicate he thought he actually commanded, a sickening, incredibly precise dread washed right over his skin. He was watching an avalanche he simply could not reverse. He had never been the center of this family. For years, he genuinely believed he was the king. His power felt so completely absolute that the illusion seemed like solid concrete. But as Serafina drifted through the mob bosses, the room physically shifted around her very presence. Damien was not watching a loyal wife returning to her husband's shadow. He was watching an entire criminal empire expose its true load-bearing wall. And he always thought that wall was him. Suddenly, a voice broke through near the Chicago crew. It was Ware, muttering something way too quiet for Damien to catch. Serafina's face instantly shifted into something deadly serious. She pivoted to Russo, dropping a few quiet words. Russo's jaw clamped tight, not with the petty politics of the room. Something truly ugly was moving under the floorboards. A threat Serafina clearly knew about before she even stepped out of her armored SUV. Russo stood there looking like a man desperately rewriting a war plan he thought was totally flawless. Damien instinctively took a single step forward. He had to catch those whispers. Needed to know exactly what was ripping through his room, his summit, his family. The blind panic he had been choking down for 2 solid hours was finally boiling over. He was spiraling out of control. Hell, maybe he never actually held the reins at all. And whatever the Chicago boss just handed Serafina, whatever forced her face into that terrifying mask of cold stone, it was undeniably bad news. The heavy oak doors locked shut behind her last guard. Whatever violence was coming next was trapped right in here with them. Ware had only spoken 4 words to Serafina. Damien was too far back to hear the exchange, but he felt the brutal physical impact. He watched her spine lock tight, shifting just a fraction of an inch. Her eyes burned into empty space right over Russo's shoulder. She stood totally frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. Then she finally spoke. Anyone else would have missed the shift entirely. Damien had shared her bed for 11 straight years, yet only now realized he could not read this woman at all. He crossed the room, slowly. No way would he give these animals the satisfaction of watching him sprint toward his own wife, on his own turf. But he moved with real purpose. The enforcers standing between him and Serafina just stepped aside without a single word. That stung, a quiet, burning humiliation. They parted out of pure habit, pure muscle memory from the fading weight of his family name. But every single eye stayed locked on her. Ware was already debriefing as Damien approached. He confirmed the hit went down an hour ago. Delgado's crew finally tracked the courier. Russo snapped, demanding to know exactly which courier. The guy holding the revised terms, Ware replied, his tone completely dead. Perfectly calibrated. Like a soldier who burned away every trace of feeling, so nobody could ever use it against him. Ware explained the ambush went down out on the road. The master documents were copied. Copied, Serafina repeated the word. It was definitely not a question. And altered. Ware added. Russo cursed under his breath in some dialect Damien could not even place. Serafina did not even flinch. She just stared straight at Ware. Her gaze was sharp, mentally striking, the weak joints of a collapsing empire. She demanded the exact timeline. Ware stated those forgeries required at least 3 weeks to fully implement, which meant somebody knew about this Mafia summit, long before the formal invites ever dropped. She shot a look directly at Russo, way before the agenda was even drafted. Russo looked like he had just swallowed broken glass. He muttered that the suspect list was incredibly short. Yes, Serafina agreed, it really is. Damien finally hit his absolute breaking point. He demanded, someone explain what the hell was actually happening in his house. The circle shifted. Ware merely studied him with cold academic interest, weighing a variable he had not fully calculated. Russo wore the grim expression of a soldier, ripping up a battle plan he thought was airtight. Serafina looked directly at Damien for the very first time since breaching those doors. She warned him to back off. Now was not the time. This was his summit, sure. But someone had just compromised the major cartel shipping agreements. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it hit like a lead pipe. The contracts they were supposed to sign tonight were completely rigged. If they moved forward and blindly inked those documents, 7 crime families would be locked into terms that 3 of them would violently reject within 30 days. She paused, and in 30 days. That meant an all-out mob war in the streets. Damien asked what kind of war. She just stared at him. Her eyes held something incredibly heavy. Not pity, not contempt either. It was something permanent. The exact kind of bloodshed I have been holding back for years, she told him. Then she simply turned her back. Damien stood on the cold edge of the circle. He felt the sick vertigo of a man stepping confidently onto a solid floor, only to plunge into a 3-inch drop. The next 20 minutes were purely operational. Serafina worked the room with the brutal efficiency of a syndicate boss, executing a contingency plan she built months ago. She cornered Aguilar for exactly 4 minutes. Damien stood back and counted every single second. He knew better than to intervene now. Then she moved straight to the heavy hitters from the Caribbean Consortium. She spent even longer with a woman named Ortega, a mid-level player from the Mid-Atlantic factions. Damien had always written Ortega off as a peripheral associate, someone whose street corners were just too small to matter. Now he was rapidly realizing his threat assessments were totally dead wrong. Across the massive hall, Celeste had quietly retreated to the far wall. She stood by the mahogany bar, completely sober. Her shoulders were rigid. It was the careful posture of someone who knew the safest play right now was staying small, still, and totally invisible. She was no idiot. She felt the shift in underworld power. The second Serafina breached those doors, tonight's entire agenda was dead and buried. Damien finally tracked down Russo. He approached Russo, purely because the underboss was the only man left willing to treat him like an equal, even if the foundation of that respect had just crumbled to absolute dust. Damien asked him point-blank about the courier. What exactly was inside that locked briefcase? Russo held his gaze. The revised trafficking quotas for the Northeastern Corridor, he said, and the amended routes for the entire distribution network. He paused. You signed off on the original cartel framework 6 months ago, Russo reminded him. Damien snapped back that he knew damn well what he signed. Then, you know those Northeastern quotas were the breaking point for 3 rival syndicates, Russo countered. They only showed up tonight because Serafina personally guaranteed the final draft fixed their issues. Russo grabbed his glass. He stared straight into the clear liquid. If their street intel was right, the final version did not just ignore those concerns, it actively weaponized them. It buried the poison deep in legal jargon, perfectly designed to look like some minor accounting error. Damien asked who stood to gain from a move like that. Russo slammed his drink down. That is the million-dollar question. Damien pointed out that 4 separate mafia crews in this very room would see massive profits if the Northeastern Alliance burned to the ground. He didn't even need to spell it out. They both knew exactly which 4 families. Damien ran the heavy names through his head. He thought about the painfully short list of insiders who actually knew about this underground summit before the invites went out. He thought about who had high-level access to the master documents, the courier's exact travel route, and that tight 3-week forgery window Ware just mapped out. This was an inside job, Damien muttered. Obviously, Russo replied. Planned weeks before tonight. The older underboss turned to survey the crowded floor. Someone had decided to weaponize this entire gathering, using the raw psychological pressure of trapping all the bosses in one room. They wanted to spark a brutal massacre that looked completely spontaneous. A mob war that kicks off at a peace summit is almost impossible to trace back to the match. Damien felt a sudden, freezing dread creep right up from his gut. They wanted a war, he said. Russo corrected him. They wanted specific factions to start a highly specific war. Right here on this very floor. Russo locked eyes with him. Think about it. Your summit. Damien. Your signature on those original contracts. Your meeting. Your grand estate. Your personal agenda. He let that hang heavy in the air. And your wife's hard-earned credibility, used as the ultimate bait to drag everyone inside. The brutal reality of that trap took a few agonizing seconds to finally sink in. Serafina has nothing to do with this setup. Damien insisted. Russo agreed, his tone completely flat. She is perfectly clean, which is exactly what made her the ideal pawn. Whoever orchestrated this hit knew her street reputation would pull in the bosses, who never would have showed up for yours alone. Russo picked his glass right back up. They have been tracking her moves on the street for months, Russo added. They calculated her true value long before you ever did. Damien walked away without another word. He needed oxygen, needed to clear his spinning head. He paced to the far edge of the hall, brushing past untouched catered food and melting candle stubs. The elegant mask of a high society syndicate dinner was rotting away in real time, revealing the incredibly ugly, cutthroat reality underneath. He backed into a dark shadow by the windows. He pulled in a ragged breath, desperately trying to organize the facts. Someone plotted this massive hit, a phantom with high-level access, cold patience, and a lethal understanding of modern cartel politics. The traitor knew about the sit-down weeks in advance. They knew the internal money laundering ledgers well enough to forge fake clauses that could sneak right past the initial financial audit. And they timed the strike perfectly to line up with the total collapse of Damien's marriage. Or maybe they did not just time it, maybe they actively triggered the fallout. Did someone know he was plotting to leave Serafina? Did they gamble that, without her sharp eyes at the table, those poisoned mafia contracts would get signed in blind faith? His mind was racing toward a terrifying conclusion he really did not want to face. A quiet voice suddenly broke his focus, joking that he looked like a guy doing some truly desperate math. He spun around. It was a woman in her 50s. She wore the kind of aggressively average face Damien was suddenly highly suspicious of. She rode with the Ortega crew. He didn't even know her name. Just running some internal accounting, he muttered. She hummed in soft agreement, watching the tense crowd. Your wife is an absolute force, the stranger noted. Damien just nodded. She made sure he knew that wasn't a compliment to him. Her tone stayed entirely polite, carrying zero aggression. She praised Serafina purely on her own merit, an influence totally independent of whatever she meant to him. He kept quiet. I've done business with her twice, the woman added. Minor territory disputes, nothing bloody. Serafina has a quality you just cannot fake, she explained. She actually makes stone-cold killers feel like their grievances matter. The woman shot him a sideways look, adding he'd be shocked how rare that is in the underworld. Then she walked off. Damien shoved his way back toward the center of the hall. Serafina had already corralled the principals, the heavy-hitting bosses of the 7 core families. She was dragging them right into a private side room. Damien followed the suits inside. Nobody stopped him, but absolutely nobody invited him. Either, the back room felt suffocating, dominated by a heavy oak table with exactly 12 chairs. The crime bosses immediately sat down. Serafina stayed standing. It threw off the entire room. She never claimed the said seat. Yet her sheer gravity forced the space to bend entirely around her. These contracts are toxic, they cannot be signed, she announced. No polite intro. No apologies. She was strictly running the room now. She needed the original blueprints, demanding to know if anyone held a clean copy of the pre-revision framework. Aguilar reached slowly inside his jacket. He pulled out a folded ledger and tossed it onto the wood without a single word. Serafina snatched the document, scanning the pages. This is the March draft, she stated flatly. Someone across the table muttered a yes. We're missing 6 entire weeks of amendments, she noted, tossing the paper down. Her eyes swept the room, studying their faces. She demanded to know exactly who received the revised terms and when. 10 minutes later, the timeline was mapped. 3 men had been handed the altered version. 2 of those men actually spotted the minor discrepancies, but brushed them off as simple typos. The 3rd guy never even bothered reading the pages carefully. A trusted intermediary promised him, The text was practically identical to the March draft. Serafina asked exactly who told them that. The answer landed heavy, a man named Brentano. He ran a mid-size crew out of Baltimore, quietly expanding his territory for 3 years. Brentano shifted in his seat. He claimed a representative was coordinating for the Varela family. The entire room went dead still. Damien felt every single head turn his way by a fraction of a degree. "I never sent anyone," Damien snapped. Brentano kept his voice completely flat. "He claimed the guy had your direct authorization." Brentano swore the man had documentation. Damien demanded to know what kind. A letter bearing his signature. Damien snapped that such a thing was totally impossible, but Brentano just reached inside his jacket. He dropped a folded envelope right on the wood. Serafina picked it up, opened it. "Read the page." Her face stayed perfectly controlled. It was always like that. Damien finally understood it now. This was never emptiness. It was pure discipline. Yet, something tightened around her eyes, right before she handed the letter over to Damien. He stared at his own signature anchored at the bottom. It was painfully exact, the specific swoop of his capital D, the precise way the V in his last name hooked back on itself. But he never wrote a single word of this. He dropped the paper. "That's a total forgery," he stated. Serafina nodded in agreement. That meant somebody had been operating under his name. She held his gaze and told him for at least 6 entire weeks. Aguilar spoke up quietly, letting the heavy silence settle first. "This completely changes the shape of the problem," he murmured. "It changes absolutely everything," Serafina replied. "Whoever pulled this off didn't just swap out a few pages. They built a totally fake channel of communication. They impersonated the head of the Varela family to a major organization. She let that terrifying fact hang in the heavy air. That takes access," she noted, "and deeply specific knowledge. Internal knowledge," Russo added from his dark corner. Yes, Damien felt his throat tighten. He was suddenly running the exact same math the woman by the window just accused him of. The total was downright terrifying. Someone had his signature and the document framework. They knew all about this secret summit. They knew which families hated the northeastern terms. They might even know the cracks in his personal life. Aguilar turned to Damien. With the brutal neutrality of a man who already guessed the answer, he asked exactly who in the household had access to correspondence. The list was incredibly short. His personal attorney, his executive assistant, and a man named Creel, who'd served the family for 8 years. Staff could access the physical rooms, sure, but never the highly classified files. Then there was Serafina. Her access to the estate was absolute. It had always been absolute. He never once thought to lock her out. He just assumed she only managed his schedule and handled the quiet, domestic roles he boxed her into. He froze. The ugly thought hit him fully formed, and he despised it instantly. Who actually wins if this summit burns down? Who profits if the alliance splinters? Who spent years cultivating quiet ties with every boss in this room alliances he totally ignored? And who just walked in tonight, armed with devastating facts instead of relief? How did a woman sitting at home all evening know about secret couriers, altered clauses, and completely hidden timelines? Information she had absolutely no business knowing. "Damien," Serafina said. Her tone was completely level. He just stared at her. She watched him back with the eyes of a wife who just read his darkest thought and was now weighing her strike. "Don't do it," she warned. "I'm not," he lied. "You are," she said it without an ounce of anger, which somehow made it so much worse. "You're doing what terrified men do when they need a problem to have a shape they can actually manage. You're blaming me. I'm looking at the facts." He shot back quickly. "The facts," she countered, "are that someone faked your signature, corrupted your terms, and engineered this summit to end in blood. You dragged me into this room tonight by trying to keep me out. Your blind spot almost got those deadly pages signed." She took a slow breath. "And now you sit there wondering if I'm the traitor." The heavy air in the room went dead quiet. Damien gripped the forged letter hard. He stared at his wife. He thought about 11 years of marriage, 1,000 silent dinners, and every single room she entered that he never even bothered to step inside. "What do you expect me to say?" he finally asked. "Not a single thing," she replied. "I want you to sit down and let me do my job." For one very long, incredibly heavy moment, the entire power dynamic of the family hung by a delicate thread. Then Brentano spoke up. "There's something else," he muttered. His careful mask was entirely gone, leaving only raw, jagged fear beneath it. "The representative gave me something else," Brentano confessed out loud. "A secondary document I didn't really understand at the time." Serafina snapped her attention straight to him, demanding to know what kind. "A schedule," he admitted, reaching inside his jacket again. He pulled out a smaller paper, folded twice. "I thought it was just logistics for delivery windows, but looking at it now, well, he dropped it onto the table. His hand was literally shaking. Serafina picked the paper up and studied the details for 4 agonizing seconds. "These aren't delivery windows," she declared. Brentano shook his head. "No, these are hit positions." She slapped the paper flat against the wood so every single boss could see it. It was a tactical grid, names, times, and locations. The names were heavily encoded, but the targets definitely weren't. The locations were mapped to very real addresses across the city, and the execution time started at 9:45 p.m. Damien snapped a quick look at his watch. It was 9:31. Serafina raised her eyes to the panicked room. Someone planted armed assets all around this exact building tonight. She delivered the crushing news with an icy, almost clinical calm, the terrifying control of a woman, locking her own fear inside a cage. When the fake papers failed to spark the war they wanted, there was always a backup plan. She cut herself off mid-sentence. "This is the contingency." Aguilar shot right out of his chair. "Check the exits," he barked to the entire room. Russo was already frantically dialing his phone. Damien just stood there, holding a forged copy of his own name. A sickening realization crashed over him. This night was never about making a statement or securing a new peace treaty. It was never a real negotiation. It was a slaughter trap. And the only soul alive who could possibly get them out was the very wife he tried to sideline. 9:31 p.m., 14 minutes left on the clock. Serafina folded the grid and slipped it into her pocket. The gesture was so incredibly casual that it took the hardened mafia bosses a few seconds to realize what it meant. She was taking command. "Lock down the service exits first," she ordered loudly. The north loading corridor hides a secondary access point, totally missing from the public blueprints, right behind the kitchen area. She pinned Russo with a sharp look. "Your people know exactly where that is." Russo was halfway to the door, but he froze in his tracks. "How the hell do you know that?" he demanded. "Because 2 years ago you used it to smuggle an asset out of a disastrous mess. You needed a ghost to coordinate with building security." She delivered the facts, cold, zero emphasis. "No apology, I arranged that clearance for you. Kept my mouth shut afterward because it was handled." Russo stared at her, completely stunned, then vanished straight down the hall. Aguilar huddled in a corner, barking fiercely into his phone. The 2 Caribbean men, Damien finally remembered. The tall one was Celestin, shifted fast to block the main doors. They moved with the silent, lethal economy of muscle raised on cartel ambushes. Brentano had not even twitched. He just sat at the heavy mahogany table, hands pressed flat, staring into the void. The hollow look of a mob boss realizing he just signed his own death warrant. Damien stared at the scattered papers, a tactical grid, coded hitmen and exposed targets. "How many?" he asked. Serafina turned around. "How many what?" she asked. "How many guns are waiting outside?" "The grid marks 8 strike points," she explained. "Standard Mafia tactical doctrine means 2 or 3 shooters per point, so anywhere from 16 to 24 men." She rattled it off like a grocery list. "But that is just the absolute minimum. A syndicate hit this massive always holds reserves in the dark." Damien squinted. "You have seen this setup before." She said she had dismantled this exact operation before. Shot him a freezing glance. "Twice, actually. Different crews. Exact same architecture. Then you know how to break it." Damien pushed. "I know their playbook. Which buys us some precious time." She snapped her focus right back to Brentano. "The guy who handed you those fake orders, describe him." Brentano finally blinked out of his trance. "Pretty heavy guy," Brentano muttered, getting soft in the middle. "But definitely a brawler back in the day. Mid-40s, dark hair going gray. He had this mid-Atlantic accent, but it sounded kind of forced. Rehearsed height." She pressed him. 6 feet, maybe slightly under. Serafina stepped closer. "Did he have a nasty scar right at the base of his left thumb?" Brentano widened his eyes. "Yes." Serafina let the room stay dead quiet for 3 long seconds. For the first time tonight, her composure showed a seam. Not a crack, not raw emotion. Just the dark shadow of something massive, moving just beneath the ice. Damien pressed her. "You know him." She said she knew exactly who he worked for. Then she straightened up. "Or who he worked for until recently," she added. Damien demanded a name. She just studied him, her eyes heavy, with the brutal math of a boss deciding exactly how much truth to bleed out at once. She needed to verify one last thing before saying that name out loud. He pushed back Serafina. She cut him right off Damien. Her tone dropped, not softer. Painfully concentrated. "I need 15 minutes. And I need you to stay completely out of my way while I get them." "Can you do that?" A question that was never actually a question. Damien recognized the tactic immediately. He had used versions of it himself on his own street soldiers. On men whose free will he was temporarily stripping away. but absolutely nobody had ever pulled it on him. He just stood there and said nothing, which was, he slowly realized his answer. She turned and walked out. Damien trailed her to the doorway, watching her cross the main hall. The whole atmosphere out there had completely mutated over the last few minutes. All that polite mafia social architecture was gone. Careful seating arrangements abandoned. Now people huddled in tight, paranoid clusters, burner phones were out, suit jackets subtly shifting, making quiet room for the heavy firearms strapped beneath them. That catered dinner, nobody touched, looked like a forgotten stage prop from a totally different play. Relics from earlier tonight, back when the only real stakes were petty humiliation and bruised egos. Over by the bar, Celeste was still just standing there. She had not moved a single inch. She watched Damien from across the floor, wearing the bone-tired look of a civilian who finally realizes they wandered into a mafia war zone that has absolutely nothing to do with them. He crossed the room toward her. "You really should go," he told her. She asked if it was even safe to walk out. Damien checked the main entrances. 2 venue security guards were now standing shoulder to shoulder with heavily armed enforcers from the rival families. "Wait 20 minutes, he said. "Then one of Aguilar's soldiers will sneak you out through a side door." Celeste just stared back at him. "Are you all right?" That question caught him completely off guard. He had not expected it at all. It was not just the sudden concern, but the raw directness of her delivery. Zero calculation, no angle, no hustle, just the plain human inquiry of someone standing dangerously close to the fire, checking on a face she actually recognizes. "No," he admitted. Celeste slowly nodded. She did not say another word. There was absolutely nothing she could say to fix this mess, and she was smart enough to know that, for one strange, compressed second. Damien found himself genuinely respecting her for it. Then he went right back to work. The 15 minutes Serafina demanded quickly bled into 20. Damien burned that time doing the one thing he had totally neglected all night. He just listened. He drifted through those tense clusters of people out in the hall, hugged the shadows, kept his mouth entirely shut, absorbing every broken fragment of conversation he could catch. What he heard mapped out a criminal network he never even knew existed. A made man from the Italian syndicate was whispering to an Albanian enforcer. The Italian swore that the last time someone tried a stunt like this, a fake war disguised as a broken alliance, Serafina hunted down the rat in under 48 hours. Damien heard the exact word the Italian used to describe his wife. Surgical. She was surgical. Then he caught Aguilar, speaking low into a burner phone. Aguilar was confirming that the 3 Eastern crime families had standing orders for any summit breach. Their explicit instructions were to lock down their positions and wait for Serafina to make the call before firing a single shot. Standing orders. Agreed upon entirely without Damien knowing a single thing. Arranged completely behind his back. Probably before he even took full control of the family operations. Then he spotted Brentano. The same Brentano who looked absolutely terrified earlier was now snarling at Celeste in a low, vicious tone. Damien only caught a few fragments of the threat. Creole. 8 months, and the Baltimore restructuring. Damien stopped dead, not Creole. Creole. He practically tore right back into the side room. It was totally empty now, just the forged documents and untouched water glasses sitting on the table. He stood alone in the dead silence. He took the name Creole and shoved it into the jagged puzzle he was building in his head. Marcus Creole, 8 years on the payroll, executive assistant, the man who controlled Damien's calendar, his private letters, his secure meetings, his entire paper trail. The one man with absolute access to Damien's signature, not just digital copies, but the physical stamps and seals driving the entire Varela family business. The guy who knew about this Mafia summit months in advance, because he personally helped organize it. Suddenly, a cold, sickening clarity washed right over Damien. He remembered how twice in the last year, Creole casually asked very specific questions about Serafina's private schedule, her travel routes, her totally unlisted commitments. Questions Damien had happily answered, without a single second thought. Creole was trusted. 8 years of blind loyalty turned the man from a hired worker into pure infrastructure. He was so constantly present in the room that he basically became completely invisible. Damien slowly sank into a chair. That forged letter was still sitting right there. He picked it up, stared hard at his own forged signature. He had watched Creole handle his private mail 10,000 times. Not once had he actually paid attention to it. The door suddenly swung open. Serafina walked right in. Russo was right behind her, shadowing a young woman Damien had never seen before. Early 30s, she carried the coiled, dangerous energy of a cartel soldier surviving purely on raw adrenaline and cold discipline. She held a secure tablet in her hands. "Sit down," Serafina ordered. That command was aimed at everyone in the room, Damien included. There was something about that flat, perfectly equal tone. The fact that she was treating her own husband like just another street soldier made him drop right into the chair without a fight. "Tell me about Creel," Damien demanded. Serafina met his eyes. That tiny fracture he noticed earlier was cracking wider now. Damien finally realized it was not fear, or at least, not just fear. It was deeply personal. The crushing weight of being proven absolutely right about a betrayal you prayed was a mistake. "His name is not Marcus Creel," she said softly. "Well, the name itself is real, but it belongs to a dead man. The ghost sitting right outside your office for 8 years. Bought that identity back in 2016. She slowly sat down across from him. "His real name hardly matters anymore. What matters is exactly who owns his leash." She gave the young woman a very subtle nod. The woman flipped the tablet toward Damien. A surveillance photo filled the screen. It showed a heavy-set man in his 60s, radiating that greasy, arrogant confidence of a mob boss who built a fortune in a business that kills people for asking questions. The picture was snapped at some outdoor VIP event. Looked like a private racetrack. Thoroughbreds blurred in the background. Damien instantly recognized the face. He studied the glowing screen, just to be absolutely certain, then let out a heavy breath. "That is Harlan Voss, yes," Serafina confirmed. Voss's Damien practically choked on the rest. He scrambled to organize every scrap of syndicate intel he possessed on Harlan Voss. It felt bizarre. Voss was a ghost he knew about for years, but never once considered an actual threat. Voss ran rackets out in the Midwest. He was not a boss of the 7 major families, not some kingpin, just a bottom feeder with incredibly deep pockets, massive reach, and a knack for skimming margins without triggering a full-scale mob war. "Voss is not in this building tonight," Damien said. "No," Serafina replied. "He definitely was not invited. He never has been. He is not." Damien struggled to find the right insult. "He is not at the table." Russo grunted from the shadows. That phrase hit the room like a hammer. Not at the table, in their brutal underworld. Those words carried the exact weight of a death sentence. "And he has been clawing for a seat there for 15 years. Serafina added. "Voss completely refuses to align with the recognized syndicates. His crews operate entirely in the dark spaces between our borders. The man feeds on pure chaos. He gets rich whenever major mafia alliances collapse. Blood in the streets creates massive financial openings that simply do not exist during peacetime." She calmly folded her hands. "I have tracked him for 4 years, she said. "You never said a damn word to me," Damien snapped. "I tried to warn you 18 months ago." She shot back. "But you told me not to bother you with external security assessments." The bitter memory clawed up his throat. He had said those exact words. She had interrupted a sit-down, walking into his office while he met with Creel and 2 capos. Damien treated his wife like a domestic chore, brushing her off like some minor inconvenience. Brutally fast, without a second thought. Damien asked what she tried to tell him, his voice entirely hollow. "I tried telling you, we had a rat bleeding Summit secrets to Voss," she replied. "An active leak I had not fully exposed yet." Serafina let the silence stretch out. "I finally nailed the leak 6 weeks later. It was Creel." The room went dead quiet. 6 weeks later, Damien repeated. The math hit him hard. "That means you have known about Marcus Creel for roughly 5 months. She held his stare without blinking. "I had to manage his clearance carefully. I spent months feeding Voss poisoned intel through him, mapping the entire hostile operation before pulling the trigger." She paused, "But I never anticipated the forged letter. That was a brand new layer," she said. "Voss threw that curveball when his original blackmail scheme fell apart." Damien felt completely numb. She knew his assistant was a traitor for 5 whole months, and just let him stay. "I was building an airtight case," she argued. Damien snapped that Creel forged his signature. "I know," she replied. "He was in my sanctuary, handling my most dangerous secrets. I know, Damien." Her voice stayed perfectly level, though the brutal effort showed in her tight jaw. "I was managing it," she insisted. "My crew tracked his lines. I saw every single document he touched. What I lacked until tonight was Voss's true network. I needed to know his assets, where they sat, and exactly which mafia families inside this alliance he actually controlled." She pointed at the tablet. "Now I have that, because he deployed them tonight." Damien glared at her. "You let it get this far. You knew, and you just." "I did what I always do," she interrupted. Right then, something finally cracked. Not rage, just the suffocating pressure bubbling beneath it, the iron control slipping away. "I worked the problem quietly," she said. "I had to ensure that when I struck, it was permanent, not some weak half measure that left Voss operational and warned. She stopped to take one sharp breath. I managed this for 5 months. I juggled 6 other crises across 3 territories, keeping this fragile syndicate from bleeding out, all while she abruptly cut herself off. Dead silence filled the room. Russo stared up at the ceiling. The woman holding the tablet suddenly found her screen deeply fascinating. Damien just studied his wife. He saw the controlled fury burning in her face, but also the bone-deep exhaustion beneath it. 5 months of crushing weight carried entirely alone. All because 18 months ago, he told her not to get involved. The assets outside, Damien said. Voss's people, yes. She forced herself right back to baseline. He watched her physically reset, shoulders dropping, jaw unclenching. That is the exact contingency I mentioned before. When the documents failed to trigger a war, and the summit held together, Voss simply shifted to his secondary option. Damien asked what her contingency was. Remove the obstacle, she replied plainly, me. That single word dropped into the room like lead. Russo suddenly realized Voss was not actually after the alliance. It was just the method, never the true target. Serafina looked right at him. He needs me out because as long as I function, he cannot create his chaos. He tried 3 times in 4 years to engineer conflicts, poisoning my ties with these families. This is his 4th attempt. A heavy pause followed. It is also the most serious one. Damien shoved his chair back. He planted both hands flat against the table, exactly like Brentano had done earlier, not for support, just to feel something completely solid. Damien demanded to know where Creel was right now. He was in your office at 7 p.m., but my people lost him after that. Serafina watched her husband closely. He knows we are onto him, because someone tipped him off. Damien asked who did it. That is what I do not have yet. Staring at the heavy door, Damien thought about the last 8 years. 8 years of pure proximity and raw access. Trust handed over, automatically exactly the way a man trusts the concrete foundation of his own house. Not because you ever checked it, but because you simply forgot it could break. Creel was standing right there. When Damien made the call to leave Serafina behind, he heard every single word, almost certainly feeding it straight to Voss, before the sun even set. Suddenly, the timing made perfect, sickening sense. Voss knew Serafina would not be at the summit tonight. He built the entire trap around her absence, and Damien practically handed it to him, on a silver platter. I gave him this, Damien said quietly. Nobody in the room disagreed. My call tonight, benching Serafina he knew, and he built his backup plan around it. If she is not here to intercept the leak, the street war begins. If she shows up anyway, Damien stopped short. Then the documents do not matter at all. Serafina finished the thought, and he triggers the heavy assets. Suddenly, the tablet pinged sharply. The woman holding it glanced down, her face twisting into a look Damien already knew meant pure disaster. What is it? Serafina asked. The north exit, the woman said quietly. Russo's crew just found something planted in the service corridor. Russo crossed the room to check the tablet. He stared at the glowing screen, his expression twisting into something dark and profoundly ugly. That is not an asset placement, he muttered. No, the woman replied. Serafina took the device and stared at the image for a long time, so long that the dead, icy stillness of her focus became its own terrifying answer. It was the look of someone verifying absolute ruin before allowing herself to react. She slowly passed the tablet to Damien. The screen showed a grainy photo of a service corridor, bare concrete under harsh industrial bulbs. And sitting right there on the floor was a device Damien instantly recognized by its crude, brutal shape. He had seen hardware like this before, mostly in places he never talked about. It was pretty easy to identify, and it was absolutely massive. There are more, Serafina stated. That is not the only choke point on the summit schedule. Damien looked up from the glaring screen. He was not trying to spark a turf war, she told him, and all the heat had drained completely from her voice. What remained was something infinitely colder. He intends to end the summit entirely. Every boss in one room, and every major crime family trapped beneath one roof. One blast leaves 0 survivors. The alliance does not just fracture, it completely vaporizes. She stared at the heavy reinforced door, and in that massive vacuum, Voss takes the crown, Russo said. Voss takes it all, she confirmed. Damien stared at the photograph again. The rigged explosive in the corridor. The walls around them. 43 souls drinking beneath marble and chandeliers. Totally oblivious that a century of Mafia history was about to burn. How long do we have, he asked. The schedule read 9:45. Serafina checked her watch, it was 9:41. Just 4 minutes. Maybe less if they rushed the timer. She met his gaze, there was no panic in her eyes. Just the terrifying, compressed clarity of a boss who had run out of time for anything except the immediate kill. I have a crew ready to hit these positions, she told him. But the main hall has to be emptied first. And I need you to do it, because out there, those men will move much faster for you than they will for me. You are still the Varela heir, Damien, for the next 4 minutes. That specific name is the only currency in this building that can push 40 armed mobsters toward the exits without sparking a bloody standoff. He understood exactly what she needed from him. She was asking him to be a tool, not her husband, not the arrogant fool who paraded in tonight with another woman, wearing his bruised pride like a shield. She needed him to play the heavy, to wear that ancient Varela bloodline like armor, commanding absolute respect from a room packed with wolves. Just give me 4 minutes, she had asked. By her, the silence needed to keep everyone breathing. It was the truest thing spoken between them all night. He put the tablet down, smoothed his tailored lapels. Then he turned and marched straight back into the main hall, ready to burn the very last piece of himself he still owned. Behind him, Serafina was already working the secure line. Her voice dropped icy, almost surgically precise. She deployed ghosts he had never met into hidden corridors he never even knew existed, dismantling a slaughterhouse from the inside out. Damien strode back into the grand dining room. He remembered the fundamental rule of control. Always secure the highest ground. A raised mahogany platform anchored the north end. 2 steps led up to a podium everyone had totally ignored all evening. He walked straight toward it. No running, no shouting, none of that theatrical panic that would instantly turn 40 paranoid mob bosses into 40 completely separate, heavily armed liabilities. He took the steps, planted his hands firmly on the podium edge, waiting exactly 2 seconds for the heavy hitters to finally lock eyes on him. They did. He told everyone to listen. No screaming. Instead, he pitched his voice perfectly at the frequency of a true boss who expects the entire world to shut up when he speaks. The massive dining hall went completely, suffocatingly silent. He announced they had a critical security breach in the building. He ordered every principal and their immediate muscle to move toward the east corridor, that hallway right through those double doors. Away from the kitchens, he told them to do it right now. Leave the coats, leave the phones. Move. The entire room froze for one singular, heavy beat. The lethal hesitation of 40 ruthless criminals, minds rapidly calculating if the man barking orders was guiding them to safety, or walking them straight into a firing squad. Then Aguilar pushed his heavy chair back. The man stood to his full towering height and grunted a single word, "Go." The room mobilized violently fast. These weren't panicked civilians, screaming at the scent of smoke. They were hardened warlords, who practically lived right next door to the grave. They moved with a terrifying, disciplined urgency, ruthless speed, absolutely zero chaos. Heavy chairs scraped loudly across the marble floor. The sprawling, completely untouched feast instantly became a chaotic obstacle course. Candle flames whipped and died in the sudden rush of bodies making for the exit. Damien held his ground, firmly at the podium until the very last cluster of suits vanished through those east doors. Then he finally stepped down into the totally empty grand hall. He stood completely alone in the ringing silence. Crystal chandeliers blazing over abandoned plates, $1 million summit reduced to dead furniture, and then echoing from the north wing, a sudden noise. Not the massive blast he dreaded, just one sharp crack, instantly followed by 2 rapid bursts. Then the shouting hit, that frantic, animal roar of men shoved to the absolute edge of murder. He sprinted straight toward the sound. The service corridor past the north kitchen stretched out like a blinding tunnel. Fluorescence buzzed harshly overhead. 2 of Russo's hitters held the far end. Between them and Damien, the violence was already over. A man lay face down, getting zip-tied beside a half-gutted explosive device. The tech slumped against the wall, tightly clutching his shoulder. Blood pumped heavy through his fingers. It spilled so incredibly fast, he desperately needed a real trauma ward. Serafina was already there. She crouched by the bleeding man, murmuring something Damien couldn't quite catch. The guy rasped a weak answer. She grabbed his jaw, yanking his head hard to check his pupils. She delivered one final, incredibly quiet order. Then she stood up. She studied the rig, then the bleeder. Called him Torres. He was one of her very own. He looked up at her, pale and slick with cold sweat. His fingers couldn't stop the leak. He rasped that the bomb was dead. The third mechanism was the live trigger. He muttered that it took way too long. She reminded him he found it. Barely. He wheezed. She repeated it again. He found it. There was zero warmth in her tone. Just the cold gravity of soldiers surviving incredibly tight margins. She asked if he could walk. He nodded. Get up, she ordered. 2 targets left, and she needed his hands. Torres stood, pain ripped visibly across his face. But he got upright. Damien stared at the enemy pinned to the concrete and asked who sent him. Serafina replied he was a contract asset, already moving for the main hall. A local hire, meaning the actual heavy hitters guarded the last 2 targets. She never broke stride, telling him to keep up or fall back east. He kept up. Target 2 was the basement mechanical room, hot, roaring with huge water heaters and industrial grids. A total staff dead zone, easily infiltrated from the south utility door by any motivated outsider. Serafina's hitters arrived first, barely. Damien followed her inside to find 4 clashing bodies, 2 of hers, 2 enemies. They had no plans whatsoever to surrender. What broke loose next lasted maybe 30 seconds. Damien tracked it all, his nervous system locked onto the sheer brutality of the threat. Not some polished movie fight, just ugly, suffocatingly close, and deafening against the concrete. One of Serafina's soldiers dropped a heavy skull strike, buckling his knees. Her other hitter choked out the remaining threat in a desperate, shaky grapple through the entire bloodbath. Serafina never even flinched. She waited by the door, eyes locked entirely on the rig. The very second the brawling stopped, she moved, crouched down, attacking the wiring with the ruthless speed of a true professional. Damien just stared at her. 11 whole years of marriage. He never once pictured his wife in a filthy basement, dismantling a bomb. She said his name, her tone was flat, but razor wire tension hummed underneath the sound of someone completely maxed out. "Watch the guy by the door," she snapped. Damien spun around. The pinned enemy was scrambling up, launching a fatal counterattack. Damien closed the gap in exactly 4 strides. He made a vicious choice he didn't even know he had. The enemy stopped struggling. Damien stepped back, staring blankly at his ruined knuckles. "3rd position, west stairwell," he reported. Serafina stood up. The explosive behind her was entirely dead. He knew because she just walked away, dismissing the rig like absolute garbage. She explained that was the primary explosive. The rest were secondary. She met his eyes. Her chest heaved a fraction faster, the only physical proof of what this heavy chaos cost her. She warned him that Voss was watching this main unit. When it doesn't blow, he realizes the job is dead. He either runs or adapts. Damien asked how. She told him Voss was inside the building. Damien completely froze. She insisted Voss would never manage a hit this huge remotely. Not after 4 brutal years of missing her. He was right here to watch it burn. She was already pushing down the hall toward the stairwell, which meant when the primary failed, Voss was right here for the fallout. They hit the stairs in a desperate march. The west shaft was pure concrete. Overhead, red emergency strobes glared, casting vicious shadows that made the whole place look like it was already burning. They climbed up, not down. The real exit was the 2nd floor mezzanine, a massive storage wing at the Blackstone Grand. It snaked through a complete maze of dead corridors, leading straight to a private VIP door on the western wall. Russo stood waiting for them on that exact landing. Russo was heavily panting, jacket gone. He carried the dangerous energy of a boss who just traded his desk for a gun. He reported the 3rd position was clear. His guys handled it. Serafina halted, asked him how clear. 2 hostile assets. Russo said, "Neither one of them is breathing." His stare confirmed their shared definition of dead. Russo promised the rig was safe. Tomas knows his craft, Serafina exhaled. That icy steel returned in Voss. "Private hall out west," Russo grunted. "With backup." She asked for hard numbers. He guessed maybe 3, maybe more. She stared down the long corridor. Emergency strobes carved her face into harsh, blood-red shadows. Damien caught something genuinely terrifying in her eyes tonight. It wasn't fear. It was the crushing gravity of a boss who hunted this exact confrontation for 4 brutal years, standing right at the threshold, deciding exactly how violently she wanted it to end. Russo argued he should go in. She cut him off. "Just me," she repeated, giving Russo the quiet stare of a boss who never repeats herself. "Voss came for me," she said. "If your crew breaches, he triggers a catastrophe. If I step inside." She paused. He tried to bury her for 4 years. Now he wanted the sick satisfaction of looking her right in the eye. Russo muttered it was a pure suicide run. She fired back that it was the accurate plan. Glancing at Damien, she held his stare. He told her she wasn't walking in there alone. A brief flicker crossed her face. An emotion Damien couldn't quite name. Not just gratitude, something much heavier. It was the look of a boss who survived alone for so long. A genuine offer of backup sounded like a dead language. Familiar, maybe, but absolutely impossible to trust. She said his name, but he pushed right ahead. "You told me I still carry the Varela name. You said it makes the underworld step back. Does it work on Voss?" A long beat passed. "Yes," she admitted. "He respects the family." "Then I go in," Damien said. Russo scoffed. She warned Damien he wasn't built for this. "I know," he replied, refusing to look away. "But But you are, so just lay out the play. The west private corridor stretched ahead, smelling of ancient dust and dead space. Massive mahogany double doors loomed at the far end. Vintage money. Relics from when the Blackstone Grand peddled old-world elegance. Obsessively polished, totally useless, and right now bolted tight. Serafina took the left. Damien flanked right. One look, a nod, and she shoved the doors wide. The massive VIP room was packed with storage, but totally empty in the middle. 3 lamps glared inward, drowning the corners in pitch black. And there stood Harlan Voss, dead center, staging this showdown like a theater production. The guy was massive, way bigger than his intel file. Up close, Voss did not just occupy space. He consumed it. He had the immovable density of an aging brawler. All structural muscle, zero softness. A literal brick wall poured into a tailored suit. Silver hair, boardroom face, but absolutely forged in blood. 2 heavy enforcers flanked him in the shadows. These guys meant business. Voss locked dead onto Serafina. Then his eyes flicked to Damien. A cold shift rippled across the older boss's face as his brain instantly recalculated the math. The quiet twitch of a predator expecting one target and getting a total wild card instead. Voss rumbled at Damien. Was not expecting you tonight. Dead calm. Figured you were upstairs managing the casino floor. Damien shot back that the floor was handled. Voss cracked a grin, a mechanical stretch of the lips. Entirely empty of warmth. Serafina. He purred her name like a hunter tracking prey. You beat the timeline, Voss said. She fired right back. You gave me 14 minutes. And you should have given me less. In retrospect, Voss murmured. The courier was the weak point. I knew it, should have used a different channel. Total detachment. Just a seasoned professional dissecting a busted mafia operation. The letter was improvised. He went on. Good, but rushed. You would have found it within 48 hours, regardless. 24, she shot back. He took the correction with a tiny nod. I have watched your work for 4 years. You are genuinely exceptional. This is not a conversation, she snapped. No, he agreed. But I have wanted to have it for a long time. His eyes drifted to Damien. She is remarkable. Everything she did for this alliance, for these crime families, all without a shred of credit. While you brought a date. Damien said nothing. I have a proposition, Voss told them. A real one. Forget the fake offers. That was pure theater. I mean a real business arrangement. Serafina walks out of this building with me. Works for my organization. I double whatever value she currently know. She cut him off cold. You have not heard the terms. Voss pushed. I do not need to. You spent a decade playing invisible in someone else's empire. Voss kept his tone completely level, but a sharp edge finally bled through. The raw edge of a mob boss realizing his big pitch was crashing hard. I am offering something different, he pressed. Visibility, autonomy. A syndicate where your name actually belongs to you. What you are offering, Serafina fired right back, is a leash with a little more slack. Voss stayed dead quiet. You need what I do, she told him. You spent 4 years trying to force my hand, trying to break me away, by either burning this alliance to the ground, or making my position completely impossible. You do not want me in your ranks because you respect my talent. You want me there because I am the absolute only person alive who can stop yours. She held his gaze without blinking. So no. The temperature in that room absolutely crashed. It dropped the exact second Voss dropped the act. The smile stayed, but the fake patience behind it vanished entirely. The 2 muscle guys flanking him shifted their weight. Just a tiny posture adjustment. But in this mafia underworld, a micro adjustment like that completely rewrites the geometry of a room. Damien felt it in that raw, primitive way your gut registers a threat, way before your brain catches up. Sudden tension gripped his shoulders. Every peripheral detail snapped into brutal focus. A hyper-awareness of the exact space between him and those enforcers, and the distance between Serafina and every single breathing soul in that room. Behind Damien, the door clicked open. He did not turn around. He knew Serafina was not looking either. Voss stared right past them. And for the very first time tonight, his face showed something genuine. Not fear, more like the shadow right before it. That terrifying split second of realizing the room just shifted, and you are no longer pulling the strings. That would be Russo, Serafina told him, dead calm, along with 8 other people. Her eyes stayed pinned to Voss. I said I would walk in alone. I never said without backup. Voss just stared. He held her gaze for a long time. A look Damien would dissect for weeks. Once the staggering scale of her trap finally sank in. The hollow look of a boss facing the one woman he spent 4 years trying to break, realizing he lost. The devices, Voss muttered. Disabled. All 3. The documents, identified and corrected. She paused, letting the heavy silence work. The men you planted inside this mansion are either zip-tied in a basement or already sprinting for their lives. Creel, or whatever his name is, we track him down within 72 hours. He has nowhere left to run. Voss took the punch. You knew tonight might end this way. No, she corrected. I planned for it to end this way. For 5 long months, she stared at him, carrying the raw exhaustion of someone, finally dropping a massive weight. I needed you right here, in the flesh. I needed you to deploy your entire network inside this exact building. So when I brought the hammer down, it collapsed completely, untraceable. Not a temporary setback, an absolute ending. Voss slowly shifted his eyes to Damien. A weird look, not begging, not threatening, just caught in the middle. You understand. Voss told him you did not build this. You did not protect a single thing in this house. Everyone who survived tonight is only breathing because of her. I know, Damien answered softly. That plain response actually shocked Voss. He clearly expected some angry denial, the fragile ego of a mafia boss protecting his pride. But Damien's flat agreement completely knocked the wind right out of him. Russo's enforcers stepped up. Voss did not fight it. He stood there, like a man who ran the brutal math and knew the final score. He calmly straightened his jacket, shot Serafina one last look, filing away a bitter lesson. 4 years, he murmured. 4 years, she confirmed. Then they hauled him out the door. The room emptied out completely, leaving just Damien and Serafina, standing in the dim light of a second-floor storage space. A room that nearly became a mass grave for every mafia boss inside. Very slowly, Serafina sat down. The absolute first time, she took the weight off her legs, and Damien checked his watch. Almost 2 full hours. She sank onto a chair by the wall, rested her elbows on her knees, buried her face in her hands. The move was heartbreakingly normal, completely stripped of that iron control that carried her through the nightmare. Seeing her crumble hit Damien like a physical punch to the chest. She dropped her hands, staring blankly at the drywall. Torres needs a hospital, she whispered. I will arrange it, Damien promised. A tiny nod. The principals need a briefing before they even look at each other. We must step in fast before the crime families spin their own narratives about tonight. Someone must feed them the truth. Her eyes stayed glued to the floor. The documents can be fixed. Those agreements are still valid. The terms are solid. Tonight does not have to ruin the summit. I know, he told her softly. Voss's network will not vanish just because he is caged. He still has assets out there, connections. Independent operators. Tearing that down takes months of careful work. I know, she went dead silent. Damien stood across that dusty room, looking at his wife, thinking about 4 years. 5 months, 24 hours, 11 years. All those broken chunks of time she spent bleeding for this crime family, while he coasted on blind assumptions. The crushing weight of those years was something he lacked the vocabulary to touch. Serafina. He breathed her name into the quiet. She finally looked up. I am so sorry, he told her, not just for tonight. He choked on the word. The sentence was too massive to finish here, breathing the heavy residue of tonight's violence. For the massive blind spot I have been living in. She held his gaze, and then from somewhere down in the main hall a sharp, deafening crack, the unmistakable echo of a gunshot bouncing off cold marble, followed instantly by 2 more, frantic shouting, and finally, that heavy feeling suffocating silence that always crashes over a house right after the trigger gets pulled. Serafina hit her feet before the gunshot's echo even died. Damien stayed a half step back. Creel, she spat the name like pure poison, but the tone that was something else entirely. Not terror, not rage, just the raw, stripped-down panic of a mastermind, realizing one dangling thread just unraveled the whole damn plan. The shots definitely came from the main hall. She took the west corridor stairs so fast, she practically flew down them. Damien stayed glued to her shadow. Back up in the reception area, Russo's soldiers were already scrambling. Heavy boots pounded the floor, armed men violently pivoting from one neutralized threat straight into a brand new massacre. The whole estate felt entirely different now. All that sprawling grandeur under the chandeliers was suddenly a massive liability. Polished marble and wide open space meant absolutely zero cover. Brutal sight lines leaving everyone wide open. Serafina slammed straight into the main hall doors, shoving them wide without a second of hesitation. But the room wasn't the bloody chaos Damien expected. It was far more controlled and infinitely more terrifying. Just the frozen stillness of the aftermath. That suffocating quiet hanging over a fresh crime scene, right before the real panic hits. A few mafia bosses who supposedly evacuated to the east corridor were either creeping back in, or had never really left at all. They huddled near the walls in loose clusters. Everyone held that rigid posture of hardened criminals who had survived shootouts before, instinctually making themselves small. yet somehow still trying to look tough. And there, standing dead center by the long dinner table, was Marcus Creel. He looked nothing like Damien imagined, which was a fatal mistake. Damien had seen Creel just 5 days ago to hash out schedules. The guy was his usual self. Quiet, efficient, perfectly invisible, exactly the way the best support staff are. Now he stood in the dead center of the Blackstone Grand's main hall, gripping a firearm. His face wore the hollow look of a man who just crossed a line and knew there was zero going back. But he was still the exact same Marcus Creel. Honestly, that was the hardest part to swallow. No sudden villain arc, just Marcus Creel, standing in the wrong spot, gripping a weapon, 2 bodies down. One of Aguilar's soldiers braced against the east corridor wall, clutching a bloody thigh. It didn't look fatal, but still pretty bad. And one of Serafina's people, the woman with the tablet. Damien still hadn't bothered. Naming lay flat on the floor 20 feet from Creel, not moving a single muscle. Serafina saw her. Something fractured across her face. Something deeply private and incredibly raw, but it vanished instantly. She buried it behind a cold mask before Creel could use it against her. He met Serafina's gaze, claiming he was supposed to be out of the building by 9:40. The exact same voice. 8 years of that guy, delivering intel and running the syndicate books. He swore the devices were just supposed to clear the room. Nobody was meant to be there. Serafina cut him off right then. Nobody was supposed to survive. Creel stammered. He froze, staring down at the gun in his hand like it was some foreign object. Either his brain was completely shutting down, or the guy was a much better actor than Damien ever realized. "That wasn't what I meant," he muttered. "Marcus," she said. She took a slow step forward, not a threat, just claiming the space. She told him the devices were dead. Voss was in custody. Whatever job he had tonight was finished. Completely over. Creel just stared at the heavy metal in his hand. He checked the bleeding woman. Then he finally looked at Damien. "I didn't," his voice cracked, raw and totally panicked. He said. She stepped out of the corridor. He had no idea who she was. "I know," Serafina said, taking another calm step. "Put it down, Marcus. You have had me made for 5 months." It was not a question. His eyes snapped back to her as a horrifying puzzle finally clicked together, right in front of him. "You knew this entire time," he whispered. "Yes," she replied. "Then why didn't you?" She cut him off. "Because she needed the full shape of the operation." She was closer now, barely 10 feet away. 40 cartel bosses held their breath in dead silence. Nobody even dared to flinch. Nobody wanted to light the match. "I needed Voss," she told him, "not just you. You were never the actual target, Marcus. You were just the conduit." Something in his face completely shattered. It wasn't relief, not forgiveness either. It was far uglier than that. The gut-wrenching look of a man realizing his worst fear was absolutely true. He was nothing but a pawn, a totally peripheral tool. Not even the main villain of his own nightmare. "He said he would move my family," Creel muttered, his voice dropping. 8 years ago, right before he started. Voss came to him with files, addresses, the kids at school. His breath hitched. He whispered that he had no choice. "You had choices," Serafina replied. No anger in her voice, just a heavy, brutal truth. They were terrible choices, but he had them. Creel stared blindly at the pale marble. "Put the gun down," she ordered. She told him his family was completely safe in Pittsburgh, under heavy watch for 3 weeks. Nobody touched them. Nobody would. She let the silence hang. "I secured them before I made a single move on anything else. Because they were the first leverage Voss would use." Creel slowly looked up at her. The weapon dropped. Nothing cinematic about it. No grand operatic surrender. He just let his arm fall loose. The heavy metal smacked the floor. Instantly, 2 of Russo's guys moved in from the shadows. Marcus Creel, a man Damien later learned was actually named Daniel Marsh, a quiet accountant before Harlan Voss weaponized his family. Slumped down onto the freezing marble of the Blackstone Grand, he rested his hands on his knees, staring into the void. Serafina crossed the room to the bleeding woman. She crouched down, pressing 2 fingers hard against her neck. Damien watched those endless 3 seconds of silence. He watched Serafina wait for a pulse, knowing her reaction would reveal the true, unspeakable cost of this mafia war. The woman Joanna Kostic, he would later learn, was actually breathing. She had worked for Serafina for 6 years. A mother who simply stood in the wrong spot when a terrified guy pulled a trigger. She was out cold, bleeding from the temple where she hit the stone, but her chest moved. Serafina shut her eyes for 1 single second. Then they snapped open. She stood up and told the dead room they needed medics. Aguilar already had his soldiers moving. The next hour dissolved into brutal, rapid logistics. Damien worked through the bloody chaos with pure mechanical focus. Action was always a much better cure for shock than just standing around. He locked down a solid cover story with the building security before the cops showed up. It took frantic alignment between 7 different crime families, each managing their own dirty ties to law enforcement. He made the calls. He was the Varela family machine running at peak capacity. Every time the sheer horror of the night threatened to surface, he forced the staggering betrayal down and dialed another number. Voss was dragged out through the private western entrance. That extraction took way more logistical muscle than Damien could personally handle, so he handed the bastard to Russo. He completely trusted Russo's dark talent for making massive problems disappear, without leaving a single drop of blood behind. Daniel Marsh was relocated too. Serafina made a hushed call. Damien pretended not to notice. Within minutes, 2 strangers arrived. These guys clearly didn't belong to any mafia family in that room. They hauled Marsh out of the hall, gripping him in a way that guaranteed his immediate future, involved brutal interrogations inside a very dark, undisclosed basement. Joanna Kostic was rushed to the hospital. She would suffer a nasty concussion, a deep laceration, and is of strict observation, but she would live. Damien didn't feel he deserved any right to be relieved. Not after his own role in fueling this turf war, but the crushing relief hit him anyway. By 11:30 p.m., the main hall was completely reset. Abandoned plates cleared out, heavy tables pushed back. Every trace of violence was scrubbed with the cold efficiency of an underworld that always buries its own messes. The crystal chandeliers burned bright above. The pale marble floor remained freezing, utterly indifferent to the blood just spilled across it. The syndicate bosses walked back in. They returned simply because Serafina summoned them a quiet flex. Damien filed away in his mental archive of shifting power dynamics. They took their seats in total silence. Serafina stood at the head of the massive table. No podium, no grand stage. She just towered there at the edge, standing while the heavyweight sat. She laid out the entire massacre. Exposing Voss, she broke down his 4-year campaign to rip their alliance to shreds. She detailed Marsh's forgery, the doctored letters, and the explosives rigged downstairs. Then came the dead courier, the altered contract terms, and exactly which crime families were secretly pitted against each other to ignite a war. She was surgical, complete, not a single trace of arrogance in her voice. Damien watched her from his shadow against the wall. He kept away from the boss's table, standing apart like a soldier, finally understanding his actual rank. Honestly, her icy composure was far more terrifying than the treason she just described. When she finished speaking, the hall went completely dead. Aguilar finally rumbled, "What about the contracts?" Corrected, Serafina fired back. She slapped down the original March framework, along with every clean amendment. The poisoned clauses were gutted, just the exact terms they actually agreed on. She swept her eyes over the crew. "If the heads want this, we lock it in right now." "Tonight?" Aguilar asked, the word hanging heavy like a threat. "It is 11:40, she snapped. "The paper still needs blood. The business holding this cartel together hasn't changed. Voss is gone. The threats are buried." She stared down every killer in the room. "What you do with this next hour is completely on you." Brentano glared at the fresh documents resting near his hands, studied his name, grabbed the pen. It took 22 brutal minutes for the remaining dons to sign. Those 22 minutes carried a suffocating weight Damien had never felt before. Pure, crushing gravity. These ruthless men were suddenly reminded their ink traded actual human lives. For once, they handled a signature exactly like a loaded weapon. The final page turned. Nobody cheered. Nobody poured a drink. Aguilar just grunted good. It was the only sane reaction, and every boss knew it. The grand hall emptied. Soldiers bolted first to escape the thick tension. The men with blood on their hands lingered in the shadows, finishing quiet conversations. Damien watched the room clear. 3 hours ago, he stood by those stairs with Celeste on his arm, feeling like a boss making a massive statement. He made one, just the wrong one. Celeste left at 10. Aguilar's man slipped her out the side exit, exactly as arranged. She left without a single word. Good instinct, honestly. He was deeply grateful for it. The night had already done enough talking. By 12:30, the room held mostly ghosts. Just the core bosses, Russo's men, Serafina's network, and Damien. He found Serafina by the glass, where Aguilar stood earlier, staring at the skyline. Aguilar had been waiting. Serafina was just standing. Shoulders heavy, the posture of someone who finished the brutal job and felt the sudden empty space. Damien stepped up beside her. They watched the city, dead silent. He finally broke the silence. Asked about Jana. Serafina said she would be fine, she knew the risks. Damien muttered that didn't make it any less his fault. She agreed. Outside, the city kept running cold and blind. A tiny plane blinked across the dark sky. Streetlights turned red for empty roads. Damien asked what happens to Marsh now. He talks, Serafina said. He spills every secret about the syndicate. Marsh was the main pipeline for 8 years. He holds the names, offshore accounts, and vault codes, every piece of leverage needed to tear Voss apart. She studied her reflection. After he talks, his family gets relocated safely, if not comfortably. Damien scoffed. That was more than a rat deserved. Serafina didn't flinch, maybe, she said. But the intel is worth more than blood. Punishing him means explaining to federal agents how we get intelligence. We don't need the headache. She met his eyes in the glass. Sometimes the smart move and the satisfying move aren't the same. Damien let that sink in, then asked about Voss. She warned him Voss has untouchable lawyers. Tonight is a total nightmare to prosecute. But Voss only survives the underworld on his bulletproof reputation. After tonight, that reputation is ash. The empire he built for 15 years is getting carved up by us, his own crew, and watching rivals. She turned from the glass. He keeps his money and his lawyers, plus plenty of empty years to think about how he lost it all. Damien asked if that was enough revenge. She weighed the question. No, she admitted, but it is what we have. He turned around too. Now they both faced the hollow ballroom. Massive crystal chandeliers blazing over stripped tables. Outside, the black city pressed hard against the glass. I need to say something, he told her. She waited quietly. He swallowed hard, forcing the words out. I fed myself a complete lie about our marriage, about who you were, built on pure convenience and blind arrogance, all of it cleverly disguised as mafia business. He stared at the floor, finally meeting her eyes. Everything I thought I knew was dead wrong. Because of that, I put our own crew in the crosshairs tonight. Handed Voss the exact weapon he needed. A simple apology won't fix what I broke here. I know that. Serafina just listened. She offered no absolution. She didn't hand him any mercy to make the confession easier. Damien admitted. He didn't even know what he was asking for. She shook her head. You aren't asking for a damn thing. You are just saying it out loud because the guilt demands it. She held his gaze. She waited years for him to finally wake up. Not out of ego. Because living with a man who refuses reality is, she paused, exhausting. The word dropped like a stone. Damien whispered that he knew. You don't, she replied, but you are starting to. She scanned the empty ballroom. That is not nothing, she added. Damien waited. He felt the axe waiting to fall, the final, ugly shape of an ending. I am leaving the marriage, she told him. He already knew. Knew it the second she walked in tonight, with dead eyes that had absolutely nothing left to protect. Still, knowing it was coming didn't soften the blow. It hit like ice, and he deserved it. Okay, he breathed. She studied his face. She had braced for the violent flailing of a wounded mafia ego, not total surrender. He watched her mentally shift gears before bringing up the syndicate network. She wasn't burning down her diplomatic structure. The truces made tonight still needed a firm hand. The crime-family alliances had to be enforced. She bled 10 years, building that underground infrastructure. She stopped saying it would be completely reckless to just walk away and let the streets entirely collapse. He asked for her next play. She was making it official. A governing council, completely independent of his family. 1 rep from the 7 bosses. A tight crew. Real legitimacy. She paused. It is essentially what she secretly ran for years. Only now, she wouldn't bleed herself dry keeping it alive. And what about you? Damien asked. Serafina looked toward the eastern edge of the city, where pitch black was finally bleeding into the pale gray of dawn. I am going to sleep, she answered flatly. For about 2 straight days. A long beat. Then I will figure out exactly who I am when I am not cleaning up other people's blood. First human thing she said all night. No mob politics, no strategy, just sleep time. A woman reclaiming her life from the ashes of his criminal empire. Serafina, he choked out. The name just hung there in the cold air. He had absolutely no idea how to finish the sentence. He said her name, and the rest of the words died in his throat. She looked at him, understanding exactly what he couldn't say. It was the very genius he ignored, for 11 years, her ability to read the silence. To let a broken man stay broken without forcing an explanation. I know, she whispered. Aguilar materialized by the doorway. He caught Serafina's eye. She gave a sharp nod, shifting effortlessly from personal grief back to syndicate business, smoothed her jacket, and walked away. Damien watched her, watched Aguilar murmur to her, seeing how the old enforcer listened. The total respect of a 70-year-old survivor who knows exactly who holds power. Damien pictured all the shadowy rooms she commanded without him, the back-channel deals she brokered, an entire underground empire thriving right beside his own, completely invisible. She did it without his help, and worse, without his curiosity. Russo walked over, stepping right into the physical space she just left behind. Russo watched Serafina across the hall. His voice was casual, eyes fixed forward. 2 years ago, he muttered. She asked us if there was a formal way to bring intel directly to the Mafia bosses. She wanted her own seat at the table, completely separate from your family name. Russo paused heavily. We told her the rules didn't allow it. Damien swallowed hard, saying nothing. We were dead wrong, Russo admitted. The structure allows whatever the people in power decide it allows. Russo turned to leave. We were just too lazy to change the game. He walked off, leaving the massive hall to its ghosts. Then came the cleanup crew. The unseen staff who spent the massacre, hiding in the back rooms. They had absolutely no idea. Blood was shed here tonight. Their only job was to scrub the venue back to its cold, expensive shine. They moved like shadows clearing, wiping down tables, completely invisible by design. The grand chandeliers suddenly dimmed, the mansion shifting to sleep mode as the brutal night finally bled into morning. Damien slowly pulled out a chair at the stripped table. He sat down in the dead center of the room, while the staff worked around him. For the first time all night, he stopped fighting. He let the crushing weight of the fallout wash right over him. And it was heavy. The sheer scale of his own blindness was staggering, growing worse with every passing hour. Then there was the blood on his hands, bringing Celeste here, calling the Mafia summit. But the heaviest blow was Serafina. For 11 years, he mistook her silence for weakness, completely failing to see the lethal discipline underneath. The sheer weight of what almost happened inside these walls pressed hard against his ribs. He finally looked at who stopped it, his bloodline, the criminal empire he ran. All of it kept breathing for years by a woman he treated like a ghost. Admitting that didn't make it lighter, but somehow it finally felt real. He had been living a massive lie about his own legacy. The actual truth was heavier, and he completely deserved it. 3 a.m, the room sat dead empty. Just him and 2 cleaners hauling out the trash. One quietly asked if he needed anything else. Damien just shook his head. The guy nodded, got right back to scrubbing the floor. 3:30 hit. Damien sat completely alone inside the Blackstone Grand's main hall. He anchored the head of the long table under half-dimmed chandeliers. This building was supposed to be the stage for his ultimate power play. Instead, it became the exact spot his ego got entirely dismantled. Down at the far end, heavy doors stood wide open. Past the empty lobby, he stared through the glass. The city out there was bleeding into a specific gray-blue haze. Not quite night, not really day. That brutal, quiet hour belonging only to cabbies, insomniacs, and men who just barely survived a turf war. Now he had to face the real world again. He thought about standing up. Morning meant phone calls, hard talks about Voss, the new council Serafina was building, severing Creel's access to Varela family operations, a blood-soaked mess that would take weeks to audit. Then came Celeste, a short, painfully honest conversation waiting for him later this week. Pretty uncomfortable for both of them. Sure, completely unavoidable now. The syndicates had signed binding agreements tonight. They demanded serious attention. Despite the bloodshed, the Empire held firm. The alliances stayed intact. The Varela name survived the night, its operational power completely secured. The family business would keep running, exactly the way the street expected. But Damien walked away with absolutely nothing he thought he owned when he first stepped inside. Instead, he found something a lot colder, the sharp edge of real clarity, that brutal, grounding knowledge a boss only earns after being completely, publicly, irreversibly proven wrong. He finally stood up, smoothed the front of his jacket, walked across the empty marble of the Blackstone Grand Hall, stepping right past cleared tables and dead candles. He crossed the exact spot where 43 bosses just waited for the woman he tried to sideline. Then he pushed hard through the heavy glass doors. The morning air bit right into his lungs. Down at the corner, a lone figure stood beside a black sedan, Serafina, staring at her phone, breath rising in small white clouds against the freeze. She had not noticed him yet. Damien froze on the concrete steps, just watched her. 10 quiet seconds of seeing her exist completely unaware of him, totally grounded, totally contained. He used to mistake that fierce independence for a cold shoulder. Now he got it. She was just someone who never needed a mafia boss to validate her existence. Then she looked up. Their eyes locked across 30 feet of empty, pre-dawn sidewalk. She held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds. No anger, no warmth either. Just the look of a woman who slammed the book shut on this entire chapter. She was already moving on, viewing the wreckage with eyes entirely detached from their past. She glanced back down at her screen. The heavy car door swung open. She slid inside. The sedan pulled away, swallowed by the gray-blue morning, long before Damien hit the bottom step. Taillights vanished around the bend right as his shoes hit the pavement. He stood dead still. The city started waking up around him. A delivery truck, a lone cyclist. A place completely indifferent to mafia fallout. Damien Varela stood alone in the freezing cold, carrying the crushing weight of his new reality. Now came the brutal work of figuring out exactly what kind of man he had to become. The sun was coming up, not quite visible yet, but burning hard against the edge of the skyline. Concrete towers lightened by degrees as the pitch-black sky finally surrendered. The city was shedding its midnight skin, shifting into morning without a single ounce of ceremony. Damien shoved his hands deep into his pockets and started walking,